I saw my husband David lean down to whisper something to his pregnant mistress Jessica during our 3-month-old daughter's funeral service, and that's when I smiled for the first time in a week. Not because I was happy, but because Robert Hayes, my lawyer and college friend, was already seated in the back pew with a briefcase full of divorce papers and evidence of David's financial fraud. While mourners thought I was grieving alone, I was actually watching the man who had destroyed our family walk directly into the trap I'd been setting since the moment I found Jessica's ultrasound photos hidden in his car the day after Emma died. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Catholic Church, casting colored shadows across the small white casket where my daughter Emma Rose lay surrounded by pink roses and baby's breath. I should have been focusing on Father O'Connor's words about angels and eternal peace, but instead I was watching my husband of 5 years comfort another woman who was carrying his child while our own baby lay dead just 20 feet away. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 8 days ago, I thought I had the perfect life. I was 32 years old, running a successful graphic design business called Desert Bloom Design Studio from our home in Scottsdale, married to David Mitchell, who owned Mitchell Financial Planning Services downtown. We had just welcomed our beautiful daughter Emma Rose into the world 3 months ago, though she'd been born with a congenital heart defect that required constant medical attention at Riverside Medical Center. Emma was supposed to be our miracle baby. After 2 years of fertility treatments and 1 miscarriage, her arrival had felt like proof that David and I were meant to be a family. She had David's dark hair and my green eyes, and even with all the medical equipment and hospital visits, she filled our house with a joy I'd never experienced before. David would come home from work every evening and spend hours holding her, reading to her, singing off-key lullabies that made me laugh despite my exhaustion from the sleepless nights and constant worry about her condition. But Emma's heart couldn't handle the strain of the multiple surgeries she needed. Last Tuesday morning, Dr. Emily Watson called me at 6 a.m. to tell me that Emma had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the hospital. The cardiac arrest had been sudden, and there was nothing anyone could have done to prevent it. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I remember dropping the phone and collapsing on our kitchen floor, screaming until David came running from his shower to find me broken on the tile. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls to relatives, and the kind of grief that felt like drowning. David handled most of the logistics while I sat in Emma's nursery, surrounded by the pale yellow walls I'd painted myself and the stuffed animals we'd collected before she was born. My parents, Tom and Carol Sanders, flew in from Seattle to help with preparations, and David's mother, Janet, drove up from Tucson. Everyone kept telling me how strong I was being, how proud Emma would be of her mother's grace under pressure. What they didn't know was that my composure wasn't strength, it was shock. And what David didn't know was that his moment of carelessness in his grief would reveal a secret that transformed my mourning into something much more dangerous. It happened 3 days after Emma died, when I was gathering clothes for David to take to the dry cleaner before the funeral. His favorite navy suit jacket had coffee stains on it from the morning Dr. Watson called, and I wanted him to look perfect when we said goodbye to our daughter. I was checking the pockets before taking it downstairs when my fingers found a folded piece of paper tucked into the inner breast pocket. I almost threw it away without looking, assuming it was a receipt or business card. But something about the way it was folded, deliberately and carefully, made me pause. When I unfolded it, I found myself staring at a black and white ultrasound image dated just 2 weeks ago. The name at the top read Jessica Chen, and written in the margins in David's unmistakable handwriting were the words, Baby Mitchell, due March 15th. The paper trembled in my hands as I tried to process what I was seeing. David was having an affair. His mistress was pregnant, and he'd been carrying around her ultrasound photo in his jacket pocket while our own daughter was dying in the hospital. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. I sat on our bedroom floor holding that ultrasound image and felt something fundamental break inside me. Not just my heart, which was already shattered by Emma's death, but something deeper, my trust in reality itself. While I'd been spending 18-hour days at the hospital, holding Emma's tiny hand and praying for miracles, David had been building a future with another woman. While I'd been planning our daughter's nursery, he'd been planning to replace us both. The cruelest part was the timing. Emma had died on a Tuesday. This ultrasound was dated the Thursday before, which meant that while our daughter was in her final days, David had been at a doctor's appointment with his pregnant mistress, writing notes about baby Mitchell, like Emma didn't exist. I heard David's footsteps on the stairs and quickly folded the ultrasound back into his jacket pocket, but my mind was racing. How long had this been going on? Who was Jessica Chen? And most importantly, what else had David been hiding while I was focused on keeping our dying daughter alive? The next 3 days passed in a surreal haze of funeral planning and secret investigation. While David met with Father O'Connor about the service and coordinated with the funeral home, I used every spare moment to research Jessica Chen. Social media made it surprisingly easy to find her. She worked as a marketing coordinator at Pinnacle Corporate Center, the same building complex where David's office was located. Her Instagram showed a perfectly curated life of yoga classes, healthy smoothies, and recent photos of her growing baby bump with captions about blessed and excited for the future. What made my stomach turn was discovering that David appeared in several of her photos from the past 6 months, always carefully cropped or positioned to look like casual friendship rather than romance. There they were at a corporate charity event in October when I thought David was working late. There they were at a restaurant I didn't recognize in November, when David had told me he was meeting with a difficult client. Every photo was evidence of a relationship that had been developing while Emma and I needed him most. But the discovery that transformed my grief into cold determination came when I found David's backup phone hidden in his home office. I'd gone downstairs to print Emma's funeral programs on my professional printer when I noticed his desk drawer was slightly open. Inside, beneath some old business cards, was a second iPhone I'd never seen before. The messages between David and Jessica painted a picture of betrayal so calculated it took my breath away. This wasn't a moment of weakness or an affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a planned replacement of his family. They'd been discussing their future together for months, making plans that assumed I would simply disappear from David's life once Emma's medical situation became too overwhelming. The most devastating message was from Jessica, sent 2 days before Emma died. "I can't wait for this nightmare to be over so we can start our real life together. Once you're free from all the hospital drama, we can focus on our healthy baby and our future. You've been so strong dealing with everything at home." David's response made me physically sick. "I know, baby. It's been harder than I expected, but it won't be much longer. Emma's doctors don't think she has much time left, and Sarah is so consumed with grief she barely notices I'm here anyway. Once this is over, I can file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, and we can be together openly." They were planning my divorce while my daughter was dying. David had been using Emma's terminal illness as cover for his affair, counting on my grief and distraction to hide his betrayal. He'd calculated that I'd be too devastated by losing Emma to fight for our marriage or investigate his behavior. In his mind, he could mourn publicly, support Jessica privately, and emerge from our family's tragedy as a grieving father who deserved a fresh start with a new woman and a healthy baby. But David had miscalculated. The same organizational skills that had built my design business and managed Emma's complex medical care were now focused entirely on ensuring his betrayal would cost him everything. While he thought I was too broken to be dangerous, I was actually gathering evidence and planning a response that would expose his cruelty in the most public way possible. The morning of Emma's funeral, I woke up before dawn and made a phone call that would change everything. Robert Hayes had been my study partner in college before he went to law school, and I pursued graphic design. We'd stayed friends over the years, and he'd even done some legal work for my business. But when I called him at 5 a.m. and explained what I'd discovered about David's affair and his plans to divorce me, Robert's response was immediate and furious. "Sarah, what David is doing isn't just morally reprehensible, it's potentially criminal," Robert said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If he's been hiding assets or manipulating finances to prepare for a divorce while you were focused on Emma's care, that's fraud. And if he's been planning to file on grounds of irreconcilable differences while actively having an affair, that's perjury." Robert agreed to attend Emma's funeral as my legal representative, bringing with him divorce papers that would be filed immediately after the service. But more importantly, he'd spent the previous night reviewing David's financial records using the account information I'd found on his backup phone. What Robert discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. David hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been systematically moving our joint assets into accounts Jessica could access, using Emma's medical expenses as cover for the transfers. He'd opened credit lines in my name without my knowledge, and had been redirecting payments from my design business into investments Jessica was managing. The affair was bad enough, but the financial betrayal showed a level of calculation that proved David had been planning this betrayal for months, possibly years. "He's been stealing from you while your daughter was dying," Robert explained grimly. "And he's been setting up the financial groundwork to leave you with nothing when he files for divorce. This isn't just adultery, Sarah. This is organized theft disguised as marital problems." As I sat in the front pew of St. Mary's Church, watching David play the role of grieving father while his pregnant mistress sat just 4 rows behind us, I felt a clarity that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with justice. Emma deserved better than to have her death used as cover for her father's betrayal. I deserved better than to be discarded while I was drowning in grief. And Jessica deserved to know exactly what kind of man she was planning to build a life with. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The funeral service was beautiful in the way that only the most heartbreaking occasions can be. Father O'Connor spoke about Emma's brief but meaningful life, about how some souls are too pure for this world, about the hope of reunion in heaven. David read a eulogy he'd written about being proud to be Emma's father, about how she'd taught him the meaning of unconditional love, about carrying her memory forward into whatever future awaited him. Every word was a lie wrapped in genuine tears, and watching him perform grief while planning his escape made me sick. But I maintained my composure, holding my grandmother's gold locket that contained Emma's tiny hospital bracelet, drawing strength from the knowledge that David's performance was about to be interrupted by reality. As the service concluded and mourners began filing out to their cars for the procession to the cemetery, I watched David lean down to whisper something to Jessica. She smiled and touched her belly in response, and that small gesture of intimacy, in the shadow of our daughter's casket, crystallized every ounce of rage I'd been suppressing into diamond-hard determination. David thought he was managing both his grief and his future with careful precision. He had no idea that his secret phone contained evidence that would destroy not just his marriage, but his business reputation and his freedom. He had no idea that Robert Hayes was sitting in the back of the church with enough legal ammunition to ensure David spent years in court and possibly in prison. Most importantly, David had no idea that the grieving wife he thought he could discard was actually a woman who'd learned that some betrayals are so complete they can only be answered with total war. The funeral was ending, but David's reckoning was just beginning. The procession to Sunset Memorial Gardens moved slowly through the Phoenix streets, black sedans and SUVs forming a somber parade under the desert sun. I rode in the lead car with David, my parents sitting in uncomfortable silence behind us while David navigated the familiar route to the cemetery where we would lay Emma to rest. The car felt suffocating despite the air conditioning, heavy with unspoken tension, and David's cologne that I now realized I'd been smelling on his clothes for months without recognizing it as evidence of another woman's presence. David's hands gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, and I could see the muscle in his jaw working as he stared straight ahead. To anyone watching, he looked like a father struggling to maintain control during the worst day of his life. But I could see the subtle signs of stress that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with guilt. The way he kept checking his rearview mirror, not for traffic, but to see if Jessica's car was still following us. The way his phone had buzzed twice during the service, and he'd reached for it instinctively before catching himself. The way he kept glancing at me sideways, as if trying to gauge whether I suspected anything. What David didn't know was that I'd already confirmed Jessica would be at the cemetery. I'd seen her name on the funeral home's guest list when I signed the final arrangements, listed simply as Jessica Chen, colleague. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She was attending our daughter's burial while pregnant with David's child, probably telling herself she was being supportive during a difficult time. The thought of her standing graveside, watching me say goodbye to Emma while carrying the baby that represented David's real future, made my stomach clench with rage. The cemetery appeared ahead of us, its manicured lawns and mature desert landscaping, creating an oasis of green in the brown Phoenix landscape. Sunset Memorial Gardens was where David's father had been buried 3 years earlier, and where we'd purchased plots for ourselves back when we thought we'd grow old together. Now Emma would rest here alone, at least until the legal proceedings. I was about to initiate determined who had the right to be buried beside her. As we parked near the gravesite, I could see the small crowd of mourners gathering under the green funeral tent. My colleagues from the design studio, David's business associates, neighbors from our Scottsdale subdivision, and family members who'd traveled from across the country to support us during this tragedy. They were all here because they loved Emma, or because they loved us, believing we were united in our grief. None of them suspected that half of the couple they were comforting was planning to abandon ship the moment the last shovel of dirt covered our daughter's casket. I watched Jessica emerge from a silver Honda Civic parked discreetly at the edge of the cemetery road. She was dressed appropriately in a black maternity dress and cardigan, her dark hair pulled back in a respectful bun. From a distance, she looked like any other mourner coming to pay respects to a family in crisis. Only I knew that she was here, to support David through a performance, not to genuinely grieve for Emma. The graveside service was mercifully brief. Father O'Connor read from Psalms and offered a final prayer for Emma's soul and our family's healing. David threw the first handful of dirt onto the small casket, his tears genuine even if his motivations were complicated. I followed, whispering a promise to Emma that her death wouldn't be used as an excuse for the destruction of everything else we'd built together. As mourners began approaching us with final condolences, I noticed Jessica hanging back at the edge of the crowd. She was waiting for her moment, probably hoping to speak with David privately or offer some gesture of support that would seem appropriate to observers but carry deeper meaning for him. The calculation in her positioning, the way she'd timed her arrival and departure to minimize suspicion, told me this wasn't her first experience navigating the complications of being a mistress at a family event. David's mother, Janet, approached me with tears streaming down her face, pulling me into a fierce hug that reminded me why David's betrayal would hurt more people than just me. Janet had been looking forward to being a grandmother again, having lost her husband and watched David struggle with fertility issues for years. Emma's death had devastated her, and learning about David's affair would feel like losing her son, as well as her granddaughter. "Sarah, honey, you know we'll always consider you family no matter what happens," Janet whispered in my ear, and something in her tone made me wonder if she suspected more than she was saying. "David hasn't been himself lately, and I want you to know that whatever's going on, you can call me if you need anything." The comment struck me as oddly specific, and I studied Janet's face for clues about what she might know. David's family was close-knit, and his mother had always been perceptive about her children's moods and motivations. It was possible she'd noticed changes in David's behavior that she couldn't quite explain, or that she'd seen or heard something that had raised questions about his faithfulness. My own parents approached next, my father Tom wrapping me in the kind of protective hug that made me feel like a child again. My mother, Carol's eyes were red from crying, but she managed to whisper words of love and support that gave me strength for what was coming next. They'd driven straight from the airport to the funeral home when I called to tell them about Emma, and they'd been staying at our house for the past week, helping with arrangements while trying to give David and me space to grieve. What my parents didn't know was that their presence had actually provided perfect cover for my investigation into David's betrayal. While they assumed I was too devastated to handle practical matters, I'd been using their help with cooking and cleaning as opportunities to search through David's belongings more thoroughly. They'd interpreted my occasional absences from the main living areas as moments when grief overwhelmed me, and I needed solitude, never suspecting I was actually in David's office photographing financial documents and copying files from his computer. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's plan to use Emma's death as cover for his affair had backfired so completely. He'd expected my grief to make me passive and inattentive, giving him freedom to manage his double life without scrutiny. Instead, my need to understand everything about Emma's final days had led me to discover evidence of his betrayal that he'd never intended me to find. As the crowd began to disperse, I watched David make his way toward Jessica, with the subtle movements of someone trying not to draw attention. They didn't embrace or speak for long, but I could see the intimate way they looked at each other, the brief touch of his hand on her arm, the protective way he positioned himself between her and the other mourners. To someone who didn't know what to look for, it might have seemed like a colleague offering condolences. To me, it looked like a man saying goodbye to his pregnant girlfriend after successfully completing the first phase of his exit strategy. Robert Hayes had positioned himself near the parking area, as we'd planned, ready to intercept David before he could leave the cemetery. As a family friend, his presence at the funeral was completely natural, and no one would suspect that his briefcase contained divorce papers and evidence of financial fraud. He caught my eye across the lawn and nodded slightly, confirming that he was ready to execute the next phase of our plan. The cemetery was designed to be peaceful, with walking paths that wound between mature trees and memorial gardens. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Today, it felt like a stage set for the most important performance of my life. Everything had to appear normal until the moment I was ready to reveal the truth. David needed to believe he'd successfully managed both his grief and his secret relationship until the exact moment when that illusion shattered completely. As I stood beside Emma's grave, accepting final condolences and thank yous from departing mourners, I felt the weight of the gold locket around my neck. Inside was a tiny photo of Emma from her first day home from the hospital, smiling in her sleep while wrapped in the pink blanket my mother had knitted for her. The locket had belonged to my grandmother, who'd worn it through her own share of heartbreak and betrayal during the Great Depression when my grandfather abandoned their family for another woman. My grandmother had survived that abandonment, raised 3 children alone, and built a successful boarding house that supported her family for decades. She'd taught my mother that survival sometimes required strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction, and my mother had passed that lesson on to me. The locket was a reminder that Sanderson women didn't just endure betrayal, they outlasted it, outmaneuvered it, and emerged stronger than their enemies ever expected. The last mourner to approach me was Dr. Emily Watson, the pediatric cardiologist who'd treated Emma throughout her brief life. Dr. Watson had worked tirelessly to give Emma every possible chance, and her genuine grief over losing her tiny patient was evident in her tears. She pulled me aside for a private word, her voice gentle but concerned. "Sarah, I want you to know that Emma's final days were peaceful," she said, squeezing my hands. "But I also want you to know that you should be proud of how you advocated for her. Your attention to her care, your questions about her treatment, the way you never missed an appointment or medication schedule. You were an extraordinary mother." The comment seemed to carry additional weight, and I wondered if Dr. Watson was trying to tell me something specific about David's involvement, or lack thereof, in Emma's care. During the most critical weeks of Emma's treatment, David had missed several important appointments, claiming work emergencies that I now suspected were actually time spent with Jessica. Dr. Watson would have noticed the pattern, and as someone who worked with families in crisis regularly, she might have recognized signs of a marriage under strain. "Thank you," I managed, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "Emma was lucky to have you caring for her. And you're lucky to have people who care about you," Dr. Watson replied, glancing meaningfully toward where Robert Hayes waited near the parking area. "Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything at all during this difficult time." The subtle emphasis on anything suggested that Dr. Watson understood I might be facing challenges beyond grief, and her willingness to serve as a potential witness or character reference in any future legal proceedings was both touching and strategically valuable. The medical community was small, and Dr. Watson's reputation for integrity and her first-hand knowledge of David's absences during Emma's treatment could be crucial if custody or character issues arose during divorce proceedings. As the cemetery emptied and only immediate family remained, David began showing signs of impatience that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with his need to check in with Jessica. He kept glancing at his phone, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and making comments about needing to get back to the house to receive visitors who'd be arriving for the post-funeral gathering. What David didn't realize was that I'd deliberately not organized a traditional post-funeral reception. Instead, I'd asked people to make donations to the Children's Cardiac Unit at Riverside Medical Center in Emma's memory. This meant that David's eagerness to leave the cemetery had nothing to do with hosting duties, and everything to do with his secret schedule with Jessica. My parents began walking toward their rental car, assuming David and I would follow in our vehicle and meet them back at the house. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, when David would be focused on executing his exit strategy, and least prepared for the confrontation that was about to destroy his carefully constructed lies. "David," I called out as he started toward our car, "I need to speak with you for a moment." He turned back with barely concealed irritation, probably assuming I needed emotional support or had some detail about the day's logistics to discuss. His expression was patient but distracted, the look of a man humoring his grieving wife while mentally calculating how quickly he could complete this obligation and move on to his real priorities. "What is it, Sarah?" he asked, his tone gentle, but hurried. "We should probably head back soon. I know people will be calling the house, and we should be there to receive any flower deliveries or food that people are sending." The lie came so easily to him, wrapped in considerate concern for my needs and social expectations. 6 months ago, I would have appreciated his thoughtfulness and felt grateful for his management of difficult logistics during a traumatic time. Today, I recognized it as manipulation designed to cut short any conversation that might interfere with his real plans. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice steady and clear, "I think we need to talk about Jessica Chen and the baby you're expecting in March." The color drained from David's face so quickly I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly for several seconds, and I could see him mentally scrambling to construct an explanation for how I could possibly know about his affair. Behind his eyes, I could see the calculations spinning. How much? Did I know? How had I found out? What was the best strategy for damage control? But what David didn't realize was that my question wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was the opening move in a chess game where I already knew how every piece would fall. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Tempe, Arizona, learned early that survival often depended on paying attention to details that other people missed. My father, Tom, worked as an aircraft mechanic at Sky Harbor Airport, spending long hours maintaining planes for a major airline, while my mother, Carol, taught 3rd grade at a local elementary school. They were hardworking, honest people who taught, me the value of education, persistence, and self-reliance. But they also showed me through their example that financial security was something you built carefully over time, not something you could take for granted. My childhood was comfortable but not luxurious. We lived in a modest ranch house with a small backyard where my mother grew vegetables and my father tinkered with old cars on weekends. Family vacations were camping trips to the Grand Canyon or visits to relatives in California, packed into our aging minivan with coolers full of sandwiches and homemade snacks. Money was always managed carefully, with discussions about major purchases and consistent emphasis on saving for the future. What shaped my character most during those formative years was watching my parents navigate a financial crisis when I was 12 years old. My father was injured in an accident at work, requiring surgery and months of physical therapy that kept him out of work longer than his disability benefits lasted. My mother took on a second job tutoring students after school, and I learned to cook basic meals, manage household chores, and handle responsibilities that most kids my age never had to consider. The experience taught me that security was fragile and that women, especially, needed to be prepared to take care of themselves. I watched my mother carry our family through those difficult months with a combination of practical skills and fierce determination that left a lasting impression on me. She never complained about the extra work or the stress, but she made sure I understood that education and financial independence were the best protection against uncertainty. By the time I was in high school, I'd developed a strong work ethic and a talent for organization that teachers and classmates noticed. I worked part-time at a local print shop, learning basic graphic design skills on the computer systems they used for business cards and flyers. The owner, Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, became an informal mentor who taught me about client service, attention to detail, and the business side of creative work. Mrs. Gonzalez was a woman who'd built her print shop from nothing after her divorce, and she had strong opinions about women and financial independence. Never put yourself in a position where someone else controls your ability to take care of yourself, she used to tell me while we worked on projects together. Build your own skills, save your own money, and make sure you always have options. The advice resonated with me, especially after watching my parents struggle during my father's injury. I decided early that I wanted a career that would give me both creative satisfaction and financial security, which led me to study graphic design at Arizona State University. College was a stretch financially for my family, but I worked multiple part-time jobs and earned scholarships that covered most of my expenses. ASU was where I met Robert Hayes during a freshman orientation mixer. He was planning to study pre-law while I was enrolled in the design program, but we ended up in the same economics class and became study partners. Robert was from a more affluent background than mine. His father was a successful insurance broker in Scottsdale, but he was down to earth and genuinely kind in a way that made our friendship easy and natural. Our study partnership evolved into a close friendship that lasted throughout college. Robert was dating other people, and so was I, but we maintained a connection based on mutual respect and shared academic goals. He was methodical and analytical in a way that complemented my creative approach to problem solving, and I was intuitive and organized in a way that helped him stay focused on long-term objectives. After graduation, Robert went to law school at the University of Arizona while I moved back to Phoenix to start my career. I spent 2 years working for a large advertising agency, learning the business side of design and building a portfolio of corporate clients. The work was stable and well-paying, but I missed the personal connection with clients that I'd enjoyed at Mrs. Gonzalez's print shop. When I was 25, I made the decision to start my own graphic design business. Desert Bloom Design Studio began as a one-person operation run from a converted bedroom in my small apartment, but I had a clear vision of the kind of company I wanted to build. I specialized in working with small businesses and nonprofit organizations, creating branding and marketing materials that helped them compete with larger, more established competitors. The early years of building my business were challenging but rewarding. I worked 70-hour weeks, handled everything from initial client consultations to final invoicing, and slowly built a reputation for reliability and creative excellence. By the time I was 28, I had a waiting list of clients and had moved into a professional office space in a business complex near downtown Phoenix. It was through my work that I first met David Mitchell. He'd been referred to me by one of my existing clients who thought his financial planning business needed a more professional image and updated marketing materials. David was 31 at the time, recently established in his own practice after working for a large investment firm, and looking to build his client base among young professionals and growing families. Our first meeting was at his office in the Pinnacle Corporate Center, a modern complex that housed dozens of professional services businesses. David was impressive, confident without being arrogant, knowledgeable about his field, and genuinely interested in building long-term relationships with his clients rather than just making quick sales. He understood the value of good design and was willing to invest in professional marketing materials that would reflect the quality of his services. What attracted me to David initially wasn't just his professional success, but his apparent values. He talked about helping young couples plan for their futures, about the satisfaction of guiding families through major financial decisions, about building a business based on trust and integrity. He seemed to understand that money was a tool for building security and achieving goals, not just an end in itself. Our professional relationship evolved into personal friendship over the course of several months. David would stop by my office to check on projects, and we'd end up talking about business challenges, industry trends, and eventually more personal topics. He was easy to talk to, genuinely interested in my perspectives, and supportive of my entrepreneurial goals in a way that felt refreshing after dating men who seemed intimidated by my business success. When David finally asked me out for dinner, it felt like a natural progression of a friendship that had been building for months. He chose a small Italian restaurant in Old Town Scottsdale where we could talk without distractions, and the conversation flowed easily from business topics to childhood stories to dreams for the future. He was thoughtful enough to remember details from previous conversations and ask follow-up questions that showed he'd been paying attention. Our courtship was steady and mature in a way that felt different from the dramatic relationships I'd experienced in my 20s. David was consistent in his attention, reliable in his communication, and clear about his intentions. He introduced me to his mother Janet and his sister Lisa within a few months, and he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know my parents and understanding my background. What impressed me most about David was his approach to building our relationship. He didn't try to rush physical intimacy or push for commitments before we were both ready. He respected my dedication to my business and never made me feel like I had to choose between career success and romantic happiness. When he talked about the future, it was always in terms of we and us, with clear assumptions that my goals and his goals would be pursued together. The proposal came after we'd been dating for 18 months, during a weekend trip to Sedona, that David had planned to celebrate Desert Bloom Design Studio's 3rd anniversary. He'd noticed that I'd been working particularly long hours to handle a demanding client project, and he suggested the getaway as a chance to relax and celebrate my business milestone. We were hiking one of the red rock formations at sunset, when David stopped on a scenic overlook and pulled out a ring box. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire setting with a diamond that was substantial without being ostentatious. But what moved me most was David's proposal speech, where he talked about wanting to build a life together that supported both of our dreams, about creating a partnership where we each made the other stronger. "Sarah, you've taught me what it means to build something lasting," he said, taking my hand as the desert sky turned pink and orange around us. "Your business, your relationships with clients, the way you've stayed close to your parents, everything you do is about creating value that endures. I want to spend my life learning from that example and contributing to something bigger than either of us could achieve alone." I said yes without hesitation, feeling like David understood not just who I was, but who I wanted to become. The ring fit perfectly, and later I learned that he'd consulted with my mother about my preferences. a level of thoughtfulness that convinced me he was serious about making our marriage a true partnership. Our wedding was held at the Desert Botanical Garden, a venue that reflected both our love of Arizona's natural beauty and our preference for celebrating important moments in settings that felt authentic rather than ostentatious. We invited 150 guests, mostly family members and close friends, and focused on creating an experience that felt intimate despite the size. David's contribution to the wedding planning showed me sides of his personality that made me even more confident in our future together. He was genuinely interested in details like menu selection and music choices, but he also deferred to my expertise in event coordination while offering support for decisions I felt strongly about. He understood that the wedding was important to me as a reflection of my design aesthetic and my vision for how we wanted to present ourselves as a couple. The early years of our marriage felt like proof that I'd chosen the right partner. David was supportive of my business growth, helpful with household responsibilities, and consistently affectionate without being clingy or demanding. We bought our house in Scottsdale together, with both our names on the mortgage and decisions made jointly about renovations and decorating. David also proved to be an excellent collaborator when it came to managing our joint finances. He helped me set up retirement accounts and investment strategies that complemented my business income, and he was always transparent about his own financial situation and business goals. We maintained some individual accounts while sharing major expenses and long-term financial planning, an arrangement that felt mature and practical. Most importantly, David seemed to genuinely enjoy being married. He was proud to introduce me as his wife, included me in his business social events, and made an effort to maintain friendships with both our individual social circles and the couples we'd met together. He remembered important dates, planned thoughtful gifts and surprises, and consistently showed the kind of consideration that made me feel valued and cherished. When we started trying to have children after 3 years of marriage, David was patient and supportive through the fertility challenges that arose. He attended doctor's appointments, researched treatment options, and remained optimistic even when the process became emotionally and physically demanding for me. When I miscarried during our first successful pregnancy, David grieved with me and immediately supported my desire to try again when I was ready. Emma's conception, after months of fertility treatments, felt like a miracle we'd earned through persistence and mutual support. David was tender and protective throughout my pregnancy, attending every prenatal appointment and actively participating in preparations for the nursery and baby supplies. When Emma was born with her heart condition, David initially seemed as devastated and determined as I was to give her every possible chance for survival. Looking back now, I can see that David's commitment began to waver when Emma's care became more demanding and uncertain. The long hospital stays, the financial stress of medical bills not covered by insurance, the emotional roller coaster of hope and disappointment as various treatments were tried, all of it started to wear on David in ways I was too focused on Emma to fully recognize at the time. But even knowing what I know now about David's capacity for betrayal, I still believe that the man who proposed to me in Sedona, who supported my business dreams, who grieved our miscarriage and celebrated Emma's birth, was genuinely committed to our marriage. The David who fell in love with Jessica and began planning our divorce while Emma was dying represents a fundamental change in character that I never could have predicted from the man I married. The foundation of strength that carried me through. The discovery of David's betrayal came from the same source that had sustained my family through my father's injury and my mother through years of financial uncertainty. It came from understanding that survival requires both emotional resilience and practical preparation, and that women who want to protect themselves and their families need to be ready to fight for what matters most. The gold locket I wore to Emma's funeral had been passed down through 3 generations of Sanderson women, each of whom had faced their own battles with betrayal, loss, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives when the men they trusted failed them. My great-grandmother, Rose Sanderson, had commissioned the locket in 1943 when her husband shipped out to fight in World War II. intending it to hold his photograph close to her heart while he was overseas. Instead, it became a symbol of her strength when he returned from the war changed by combat trauma and began drinking heavily, eventually abandoning their family for another woman he'd met while recovering in a veterans hospital. Rose had been 23 years old with 2 young children when her husband disappeared, leaving her with no income, no family nearby, and a society that offered little support for divorced women. She'd grown up on a farm in rural Arizona, where her father raised cattle and her mother took in laundry to supplement their income during the drought years of the 1930s. The combination of rural pragmatism and Depression-era resilience had taught Rose that survival often required making difficult choices without the luxury of self-pity or lengthy deliberation. When her husband abandoned them, Rose moved her children to Phoenix and found work as a seamstress in a downtown factory that manufactured uniforms for the military. The pay was minimal, but it was steady, and Rose supplemented their income by taking in mending and alterations from neighbors in the evenings. She wore the gold locket every day, not as a reminder of the man who'd left her, but as a symbol of her determination to provide for her children without depending on anyone else's promises or commitment. Rose never remarried, but she built a life of quiet dignity and financial independence that allowed her to send both her children to college. She saved enough money to buy a small house in what was then a working-class neighborhood near downtown Phoenix, and she continued working as a seamstress until she was 65 years old. When she passed the locket to my grandmother Elena in 1968, it came with stories about the importance of self-reliance and the dangers of trusting your security to someone else's character. My grandmother Elena wore the locket through her own marriage to my grandfather Michael, a relationship that lasted 40 years but was tested by Michael's gambling addiction that repeatedly threatened their financial stability. Elena had learned from her mother's example that love wasn't enough to guarantee security, and she maintained her own savings account and part-time work even when Michael's income from his job at the phone company was sufficient to support their family. Elena's caution proved justified when Michael's gambling debts forced them to sell their house and move into a smaller rental property during my mother's teenage years. Rather than becoming bitter or resentful, Elena simply took a full-time job as a bookkeeper for a local insurance agency and began rebuilding their financial foundation with methodical determination. She wore the locket every day as a reminder that Sanderson women were survivors who didn't wait for rescue from external sources. What made Elena's story particularly relevant to my own situation was her discovery, late in her marriage, that Michael had been forging her signature on loan documents to cover his gambling debts. The betrayal could have destroyed their marriage and their financial future, but Elena responded with strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. She consulted with a lawyer, documented the extent of Michael's deception, and presented him with a choice: complete transparency about his finances, mandatory counseling for his gambling addiction, and legal agreements that protected her assets from future manipulation or immediate divorce. Michael chose rehabilitation and transparency, but the damage to Elena's trust was permanent. She remained married to him until his death, but she also maintained complete control over her own finances and made sure that her daughter, my mother Carol, understood the importance of financial independence even within marriage. The locket became a symbol not just of survival, but of the strategic thinking required to protect yourself from the people closest to you. My mother Carol inherited the locket when Elena died in 1995, and she wore it throughout her marriage to my father, even though their relationship was more stable and trustworthy than the previous generation had experienced. Carol had chosen my father, partly because his character seemed steady and reliable, but she'd also built her own career as a teacher and maintained her own bank accounts as insurance against uncertainty. The lesson Carol passed down to me wasn't cynicism about marriage, but rather the understanding that love and trust had to be balanced with practical preparation for the possibility that people change, circumstances shift, and the person you marry might not be the person you're married to 20 years later. The locket represented the wisdom of women who'd learned to protect themselves without becoming hardened or unable to form genuine connections. When Carol gave me the locket on my wedding day, she shared the stories of Rose and Elena while helping me fasten the clasp around my neck. "I'm not telling you these stories to make you suspicious of David," she said, adjusting the locket so it lay properly against my collarbone. "I'm telling you so you'll remember that Sanderson women are strong, enough to survive whatever comes, and smart enough to prepare for possibilities we hope we'll never face." The locket had held different photographs over the decades: Rose's children during their school years, Elena and Michael during their courtship, Carol and my father at their wedding. When Emma was born, I'd placed her tiny hospital photograph inside, thinking it would be the first of many pictures I'd carry of my children as they grew up. Now that photograph was all I would ever have of Emma, but the locket itself had become something more than a keepsake. It was a reminder of my connection to women who'd faced betrayal and loss with courage and strategic intelligence. The family stories represented more than just personal history. They provided a framework for understanding that my current crisis, while devastating, was survivable. Rose had rebuilt her life from nothing when her husband abandoned her. Elena had protected her family's future when her husband's addiction threatened their security. Carol had built a career and maintained her independence even within a happy marriage. Each generation had faced different challenges, but they'd all demonstrated that women could take control of their circumstances rather than waiting to be rescued or accepting victim status as permanent. The practical lessons from these stories were as important as the emotional inspiration. Rose had taught Elena the importance of maintaining separate financial accounts and keeping important documents secure. Elena had taught Carol to pay attention to unusual financial activity and to trust her instincts when something seemed wrong. Carol had taught me to build my own career, understand basic legal principles, and maintain friendships with people who could provide professional help if needed. These weren't lessons in paranoia or distrust, but rather in practical preparation for the reality that life is uncertain and people are fallible. The Sanderson women had learned to hope for the best while preparing for challenges, to build relationships based on love and trust while maintaining the capability to protect themselves if that trust was violated. What struck me most about my family's history was how each generation of women had turned their painful experiences into wisdom that protected the next generation. Rose's abandonment had taught Elena to be financially cautious. Elena's experience with Michael's gambling had taught Carol to pay attention to warning signs. Carol's emphasis on education and independence had given me the skills and confidence to build my own business and maintain my own identity within marriage. The locket was more than jewelry. It was a tangible connection to this legacy of strength and strategic thinking. Wearing it during Emma's funeral while sitting next to the man who was betraying me felt like calling on the combined wisdom and courage of 3 generations of women who'd faced similar challenges and emerged victorious. But the family legacy also carried responsibility. Rose, Elena, and Carol had all protected their children and future generations by refusing to accept victim status and fighting back against the people who tried to harm them. They documented evidence, sought professional help, and taken legal action when necessary to ensure that their betrayers faced consequences. They'd understood that sometimes the only way to stop bad behavior is to make it costly for the perpetrator. As I sat in that cemetery listening to David lie to my face about Jessica Chen, I felt the weight of that legacy and the obligation to honor it. Emma's death was tragedy enough. Allowing David to use that tragedy as cover for his theft and betrayal would compound the damage and dishonor every woman who'd worn this locket before me. The stories of my great-grandmother, grandmother, and mother had taught me that survival isn't just about enduring hardship. It's about ensuring that the people who cause the hardship face appropriate consequences. They'd shown me that women who want to protect themselves and their families sometimes have to be willing to fight publicly, strategically, and without compromise. The locket around my neck wasn't just a memorial to Emma or a connection to my family's past. It was a reminder that I had the bloodline, the training, and the responsibility to ensure that David's betrayal would cost him everything he'd tried to steal from me. Some legacies are honored through preservation, but this one demanded action. The first 3 years of my marriage to David felt like proof that I'd finally found the partnership I'd been hoping for since college. We settled into our Scottsdale house with the kind of domestic harmony that made our friends joke about us being relationship goals. And I genuinely believed we were building something that would last decades. David was supportive of my business, growth, actively helpful with household responsibilities, and consistently affectionate in ways that made me feel cherished rather than taken for granted. Our house became a reflection of our shared vision for the future we were building together. The 4-bedroom ranch-style home sat on a corner lot with mature desert landscaping and mountain views that reminded us why we'd chosen to make Arizona our permanent home. David handled the mortgage and homeowners insurance while I managed the interior design and landscaping projects, and we made major decisions jointly while respecting each other's expertise in different areas. The extra bedrooms were designated as my home office, David's study, and a guest room that we privately referred to as the future nursery. We didn't pressure ourselves about children immediately, but having the space ready felt like a statement of intention about the kind of family we wanted to create. David would sometimes stand in the doorway of that empty room and talk about teaching our kids to ride bikes in the neighborhood or helping them with homework at the kitchen table. Desert Bloom Design Studio flourished during those early marriage years, partly because of David's business connections, and partly because having a stable personal life allowed me to take creative risks and accept more challenging projects. David introduced me to several of his financial planning clients who needed marketing materials, and he was genuinely proud when those referrals led to some of my most prestigious accounts. He understood that my success reflected well on both of us, and he never showed the kind of competitive resentment that some of my friends experienced with their husbands. What made our partnership particularly strong during those golden years was how we balanced independence with interdependence. David maintained his own social connections with college friends and business associates, while I continued my friendships with other women entrepreneurs and my relationships with former colleagues from the advertising agency. We had our individual interests and professional commitments, but we also created shared traditions and experiences that strengthened our bond as a couple. Sunday mornings became our sacred time together, when we'd make elaborate breakfasts and read different sections of the newspaper while sharing interesting articles or discussing the week ahead. David was genuinely interested in my business challenges and would offer insights from his financial planning experience when I was dealing with difficult clients or considering expansion opportunities. I loved hearing about his most complex cases and helping him think through strategies for clients who were facing major life transitions. Our social life during those years was rich and varied, mixing David's professional networking events with my creative industry connections and casual gatherings with neighbors and college friends who'd also settled in the Phoenix area. We hosted dinner parties in our dining room, attended charity fundraisers for causes we both cared about, and took weekend trips to explore different parts of Arizona and neighboring states. David proved to be an excellent travel companion, sharing my enthusiasm for discovering new places while also being practical about logistics and budgeting. We visited wine country in California, explored art galleries in Santa Fe, and took hiking trips to national parks throughout the Southwest. These adventures felt like investments in our relationship, creating shared memories and inside jokes that strengthened our emotional connection. The financial foundation we built together during those years was particularly satisfying because it reflected our combined efforts and shared goals. David helped me structure Desert Bloom Design Studio as an LLC with proper business insurance and retirement planning, while I contributed to our household income in ways that allowed us to pay down our mortgage faster and build substantial savings accounts. We were building wealth together while also building a life that felt meaningful and sustainable. David's business flourished during this period as well, and I was proud to see him gain recognition in the Phoenix financial planning community for his ethical approach and excellent client outcomes. He was invited to speak at industry conferences, wrote articles for professional publications, and built a reputation that attracted clients who valued integrity and long-term thinking over quick profits or aggressive sales tactics. What impressed me most about David's professional success was how he managed to grow his business without compromising his values or neglecting our relationship. He worked hard, but he also maintained boundaries that protected our time together and his own mental health. When clients called during evenings or weekends, David was polite but firm about scheduling appropriate meeting times. He understood that sustainable success required balance, not just ambition. The sexual and emotional intimacy between us during those years was everything I'd hoped for in marriage. David was consistently attentive and affectionate, making an effort to maintain physical connection even during busy periods when work demanded long hours from both of us. We talked openly about our needs and desires, and David was responsive to feedback in ways that made our physical relationship better over time, rather than falling into routine or taking each other for granted. More importantly, David made me feel genuinely seen and appreciated as a complete person. He was proud of my business accomplishments, supportive of my friendships, and interested in my thoughts and opinions about everything from local politics to interior design. He remembered details about my family relationships and my personal history, and he showed consistent consideration for my emotional needs and professional goals. The holidays during our early marriage years were particularly magical, establishing traditions that made our house feel like a true family home. We hosted Thanksgiving dinner for both our families, combining my mother's recipes with David's, family traditions in ways that honored everyone while creating something uniquely ours. Christmas mornings were spent exchanging thoughtful gifts that showed how well we knew each other, followed by visits with relatives and quiet evenings by our fireplace. David's gift-giving during those years revealed aspects of his personality that made me fall in love with him even more deeply. He paid attention to things I mentioned in passing, a book I wanted to read, a piece of jewelry I'd admired in a shop window, a kitchen gadget that would make my cooking more efficient. His presents were never extravagant, but they were always personal and thoughtful in ways that showed he was genuinely paying attention to my interests and desires. When we decided to start trying for children after 3 years of marriage, the decision felt natural and exciting rather than pressured or anxious. We'd built a stable financial foundation, established our careers, and created a home that was ready for the next phase of our lives together. David was enthusiastic about becoming a father, reading books about child development and pregnancy, and talking about the kind of parents he hoped we'd become. The fertility challenges we faced were frustrating and emotionally difficult, but they also demonstrated the strength of our partnership during times of stress. David attended every doctor's appointment, researched treatment options, and remained optimistic even when months passed without successful conception. When the process became physically uncomfortable and emotionally draining for me, David was patient and supportive without ever making me feel pressured or inadequate. The miscarriage we experienced during our first successful pregnancy was devastating for both of us, but it also showed me depths of David's character that made me even more confident in our future together. He grieved genuinely and openly, supporting me through the physical recovery while also processing his own disappointment and loss. He never minimized my emotional pain or rushed me through the healing process, and he was the one who suggested we take time before trying again to make sure we were both emotionally ready. When I finally became pregnant with Emma, David's joy and excitement were infectious. He was tender and protective throughout my pregnancy, accompanying me to every prenatal appointment and actively participating in preparations for the nursery. He assembled the crib and changing table with meticulous care, painted the walls in the soft yellow color we'd chosen for a gender-neutral theme, and helped me organize baby clothes and supplies with the same attention to detail he brought to his financial planning work. David's anticipation of fatherhood revealed qualities I'd always suspected but hadn't fully seen before. He was naturally nurturing and patient, comfortable with the idea of sleepless nights and diaper changes, excited about reading bedtime stories and teaching our child to ride a bicycle. He talked about wanting to be the kind of father who was actively involved in daily care rather than just providing financial support, and he seemed to understand that parenting would require significant adjustments to our lifestyle and priorities. The birth experience itself was challenging because of Emma's heart condition, but David's response to the crisis showed me what kind of man I'd married. While I was still recovering from delivery, David was researching pediatric cardiologists, understanding our insurance coverage for specialized care, and communicating with our families about Emma's condition. He was scared and overwhelmed, but he channeled those emotions into productive action rather than panic or denial. During Emma's first weeks of life, when we were shuttling between home and the hospital for tests and consultations, David proved to be an excellent partner in managing the complex logistics of caring for a medically fragile infant. He kept detailed records of Emma's feeding schedule and medication times, coordinated with our insurance company to ensure coverage for her treatments, and maintained communication with both our employers to arrange the flexible work schedules we needed. What moved me most during those early weeks of Emma's life was watching David fall completely in love with our daughter, despite the uncertainty about her prognosis. He would spend hours holding her in the hospital, talking to her about the future, trips they'd take together, and the things he wanted to teach her. He learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated whether she was comfortable or in distress, and he became an advocate for her care with the medical team in ways that complemented my own maternal instincts. The financial stress of Emma's medical care was significant, but David managed it with the same strategic thinking he applied to his clients' challenges. He negotiated payment plans with the hospital, researched state programs that might provide additional coverage, and adjusted our household budget to accommodate the unexpected expenses without compromising Emma's care or our long-term financial stability. Looking back now, I believe that David's commitment to our family was genuine during those first months of Emma's life. The man who held our daughter for hours while she recovered from surgery, who researched treatment options late into the night, who rearranged his work schedule to accommodate medical appointments. That man was truly invested in our family's future together. The gradual change in David's behavior began so subtly that I initially attributed it to the stress of managing Emma's care while maintaining his business responsibilities. He started working longer hours, claiming that he needed to catch up on client work that had been postponed during Emma's hospitalizations. He became less available for the daily routines of feeding and diaper changes that had initially excited him, explaining that the sleep deprivation was affecting his concentration during important business meetings. The shift wasn't dramatic or sudden, which is probably why I didn't recognize it as the beginning of his emotional withdrawal from our family. David was still helpful with practical matters, still financially supportive of Emma's care, still affectionate toward me in ways that seemed consistent with the stress we were both experiencing. But the enthusiasm and emotional engagement that had characterized his approach to fatherhood began to fade into dutiful responsibility. I told myself that David's decreased involvement was temporary, a natural response to the overwhelming demands of caring for a sick infant while maintaining a professional practice. Many couples struggle with the transition to parenthood even under ideal circumstances, and Emma's medical needs created additional stress that would challenge any marriage. I focused on managing her care and maintaining my own business commitments, assuming that David's engagement would return once we adjusted to our new reality. What I didn't understand at the time was that David's withdrawal wasn't a response to Emma's condition, it was preparation for his eventual exit from our family. While I was adapting to the challenges of being Emma's mother, David was already beginning to see our situation as unsustainable and planning his escape route. The golden period of our marriage was ending not because of external circumstances, but because David had decided that the life we'd built together was no longer what he wanted. The man who had seemed so committed to building a family with me, who had supported me through fertility treatments and celebrated Emma's birth with genuine joy, was already beginning the process of emotional detachment that would eventually lead him to Jessica Chen's arms. But during those final months when I still believed in our partnership, when I still trusted that we were facing Emma's challenges together, David was learning to perform the role of devoted husband and father while internally preparing for a completely different future. The irony is that David's betrayal began during what should have been the strongest period of our marriage, when we were united in our love for Emma and our determination to give her the best possible care. While I was falling even more deeply, in love with the man I thought was fighting alongside me for our daughter's life, David was already calculating the cost of that fight and deciding he didn't want to pay it. The golden period hadn't ended because we'd failed as a couple, or because external pressures had proven too much for our relationship to handle. It had ended because David had revealed that his commitment to our marriage was conditional, dependent on circumstances remaining comfortable and uncomplicated. When real life demanded sacrifice and uncertainty, David's response wasn't to fight harder for what we'd built together. It was to begin planning his replacement of our family with something easier and more appealing. But during those months, when I still believed in us, when I still trusted that David's love for Emma and commitment to me were genuine, our life had felt like everything I'd hoped marriage could be. We'd been building something together that felt meaningful and lasting, creating a home where our daughter could grow up surrounded by love and security. That vision of our future hadn't been naive or unrealistic. It had been betrayed by someone who'd decided that temporary comfort was more important than permanent commitment. The golden period of our marriage had been real, which made David's decision to destroy it for the sake of an affair with Jessica Chen even more devastating. We'd had everything necessary for happiness and success: love, financial stability, shared goals, and a beautiful daughter who needed both her parents. David had chosen to throw all of that away, not because it wasn't working, but because something easier had presented itself. As I stood in that cemetery confronting David about Jessica and their unborn child, I carried with me the memory of who we'd been during our best years together. That memory didn't make me weak or nostalgic. It made me furious that David had been willing to destroy something so valuable for something so temporary. The golden period hadn't been an illusion, but David's commitment to preserving it had been. The man I'd married would never have brought his pregnant mistress to our daughter's funeral. The man I'd married would have fought for our family even when circumstances became difficult. The man I'd married would have honored the life we'd built together rather than using it as a cover story for betrayal. But that man had apparently never existed. And the stranger wearing his face was about to learn that Sarah Sanderson Mitchell was not someone who could be discarded without consequences. The first sign that something fundamental was shifting in David's commitment to our family came 3 weeks after Emma's second heart surgery, when I found him on the phone in his study at 11 o'clock at night, speaking in hushed tones that immediately stopped when I appeared in the doorway. He claimed it was a client emergency, but the gentle tone of his voice and the way he'd been laughing softly didn't match the serious demeanor he typically displayed during business calls, especially those that required late-night attention. What troubled me wasn't just the call itself, but David's reaction when I asked about it. For the first time in our marriage, he became evasive and defensive, rather than offering the straightforward explanation I would normally expect. He mentioned something about a client going through a difficult divorce who needed emotional support along with financial planning, but his body language suggested there was more to the story than he was sharing. Over the following weeks, these mysterious phone calls became more frequent, always conducted in private areas of the house and always ending abruptly when I entered the room. David's explanations grew more elaborate and less convincing, involving clients with increasingly complex personal situations that required his attention at odd hours. As someone who'd been married to a financial planner for 5 years, I knew that client emergencies rarely required the kind of intimate, whispered conversations I was witnessing. The changes in David's behavior extended beyond suspicious phone calls to broader shifts in how he approached his responsibilities as Emma's father and my husband. The man who had initially been eager to participate in every aspect of Emma's care began finding reasons to avoid the most demanding aspects of her routine. He would schedule client meetings during her physical therapy appointments, claim urgent work deadlines when she needed to be driven to specialist consultations, and delegate the overnight hospital stays to me by citing early morning obligations. That couldn't be postponed. What made David's withdrawal particularly painful was how gradually it occurred. He didn't suddenly become absent or unsupportive. Instead, he slowly shifted from being an active partner in Emma's care to being a helpful, but secondary participant. He still asked about her progress and maintained involvement in major medical decisions, but the daily hands-on care that had initially bonded him to our daughter became something he delegated to me while focusing on what he claimed were pressing business responsibilities. The emotional distance between David and me followed a similar pattern of gradual erosion rather than dramatic change. Our Sunday morning breakfast traditions continued, but David began bringing his laptop to the table and checking emails while we ate. Our evening conversations about our respective days became shorter and more superficial, with David offering polite interest in my business updates while sharing fewer details about his own work challenges. The physical intimacy that had always been a strength in our marriage also began to deteriorate in ways that David attributed to the stress of Emma's medical situation and our mutual exhaustion from managing her care. While I understood that new parents often struggle with maintaining romantic connection amid the demands of infant care, David's decreased interest in physical affection seemed disconnected from the practical challenges we were facing and more, related to some internal withdrawal I couldn't understand. When I tried to address the growing distance between us, David's responses were reasonable and superficially supportive, but they lacked the emotional engagement that had characterized our communication during our earlier years together. He would acknowledge my concerns, promise to make more effort to be present, and then continue the same patterns of behavior that had prompted my worries in the first place. The most troubling aspect of David's changing behavior was how he began treating Emma's medical condition as an inconvenience rather than a challenge we were facing together. During our early weeks of managing her care, David had been genuinely interested in understanding her diagnosis, researching treatment options, and advocating for the best possible outcomes. But as months passed, he began expressing frustration about the impact her condition was having on our finances, our sleep schedules, and our ability to maintain normal social and professional activities. David never said anything directly critical about Emma or suggested that her care was too burdensome. But his comments about the stress of our situation began carrying undertones of resentment that hadn't been present initially. He would mention how difficult it was to concentrate at work after sleepless nights at the hospital, how expensive her treatments were becoming despite our insurance coverage, how isolated we'd become from friends who were dealing with typical new parent challenges, rather than medical crises. These comments weren't necessarily unreasonable. Caring for a medically fragile infant was genuinely stressful and expensive and isolating. But the tone of David's observations suggested that he was beginning to see Emma's condition as something that was happening to him rather than something we were managing together as her parents. The shift from "we're facing this challenge" to "this situation is affecting my life" was subtle, but unmistakable. The professional consequences of David's divided attention began manifesting in ways that should have concerned me more than they did at the time. He started missing deadlines for client reports, forgetting important meetings, and making errors in financial calculations that required corrections and apologies. His business partner mentioned to me at a social gathering that David seemed distracted and overwhelmed, suggesting that perhaps he should consider taking a temporary leave of absence to focus on family matters. Instead of recognizing these professional struggles as signs that David was dealing with more than just work-related stress, I encouraged him to maintain his business commitments and assured him that I could handle more of Emma's care independently. I thought I was being supportive by reducing his family responsibilities so he could focus on the career that supported all of us financially. I didn't realize I was actually enabling him to spend more time developing the relationship that would eventually destroy our marriage. David's relationship with his own family also began showing signs of strain during this period, though I initially attributed the changes to the general stress of our situation rather than recognizing them as symptoms of deeper problems. His weekly phone calls with his mother Janet became less frequent, and when she visited to help with Emma's care, David seemed uncomfortable and eager for her stays to end quickly. The most telling change was how David began responding to his sister Lisa's offers to help with Emma's care. Lisa was a pediatric nurse who worked at a different hospital than where Emma received treatment, but she had valuable expertise about managing medically complex infants and had volunteered to provide respite care when David and I needed breaks. Initially, David had been grateful for Lisa's support and had encouraged her involvement in Emma's routine. But as David's behavior became more distant and distracted, he began declining Lisa's offers to help and making excuses to avoid family gatherings where Emma's condition would be discussed. When Lisa expressed concern about how we were managing the stress of Emma's care, David became defensive and insisted that everything was under control, even though it was obvious to everyone that we were both exhausted and overwhelmed. The financial management of Emma's medical expenses, which had initially been something David handled with his typical competence and strategic thinking, became another area where his attention and engagement began to waver. Bills went unpaid longer than necessary, insurance claims weren't submitted promptly, and David stopped providing me with regular updates about our medical expense budget and payment schedules. When I asked about these oversights, David would apologize and promise to catch up on the administrative tasks, but the pattern of delayed attention to financial matters continued. At the time, I assumed David was simply overwhelmed by the volume of paperwork associated with Emma's care. But I now understand that his decreasing attention to our family's financial management was connected to his increasing focus on managing finances related to his affair. The social isolation that naturally accompanied caring for a medically fragile infant became more pronounced as David began declining invitations to gatherings with friends and avoiding the community connections that had previously been important to both of us. When colleagues from his office invited us to dinner parties or professional events, David would claim that leaving Emma was too complicated or that we were too tired to be good company. While some degree of social withdrawal was understandable given our circumstances, David's reluctance to maintain any social connections seemed excessive and disconnected from practical concerns about Emma's care. Even when friends offered to visit us at home or include us in low-key gatherings that could accommodate Emma's needs, David preferred to isolate us from outside contact. This isolation served David's purposes by reducing the opportunities for friends or family members to observe changes in his behavior or ask questions about how our marriage was managing the stress of Emma's condition. By keeping us socially disconnected, David minimized the risk that someone might notice his divided attention or emotional distance and raise concerns that could expose his developing relationship with Jessica. The communication patterns between David and me during this period showed the most dramatic changes from our earlier marriage dynamic, where we had previously shared detailed information about our respective days, discussed challenges and successes openly, and sought each other's advice about professional and personal decisions. Our conversations became increasingly superficial and functional. David stopped asking detailed questions about my design projects or offering insights about client management challenges I was facing. He shared less information about his own work situations and seemed uninterested in my opinions about business decisions he was considering. Our discussions focused primarily on Emma's immediate needs and household logistics, with little of the emotional connection or intellectual partnership that had characterized our relationship during our golden years. When I tried to initiate deeper conversations about how we were adjusting to parenthood, our financial planning for Emma's ongoing medical needs, or our long-term goals as a family, David would participate politely, but without the engagement and enthusiasm that had made such discussions meaningful in the past. He seemed to be going through the motions of being a communicative husband while mentally being focused elsewhere. The most painful aspect of this gradual erosion was how it made me question my own perceptions and expectations. David's changes were subtle enough that they could be attributed to the legitimate stress of our situation, and his explanations for his behavior were reasonable enough that I felt selfish for wanting more attention and support. I began wondering if I was being unrealistic about what marriage should look like during times of crisis, or whether I was expecting too much emotional availability from someone who was dealing with his own fears and pressures. This self-doubt prevented me from trusting my instincts about the changes I was observing in David's behavior, and from investigating further when inconsistencies in his explanations began accumulating. Instead of recognizing that my husband was gradually detaching from our family, I convinced myself that I needed to be more understanding, more independent, and more supportive of his need to manage stress in his own way. The erosion of trust happened so slowly that I didn't recognize it was occurring until it was nearly complete. David's word, which had always been reliable and trustworthy throughout our marriage, became something I found myself quietly verifying through other sources. When he said he was working late, I would notice that his car wasn't in the office parking lot when I drove past. When he claimed to be attending client meetings, the details of his stories didn't quite align with information I heard from other sources. These small inconsistencies could each be explained away individually, but collectively, they created a pattern that suggested David was not being entirely honest about how he was spending his time. Rather than confronting him directly about my suspicions, I began paying closer attention to details and keeping mental notes about discrepancies between his claims and observable evidence. The gradual erosion of our marriage during those months was like watching a foundation slowly develop cracks that eventually compromised the entire structure. Each change in David's behavior was small enough to be rationalized, each explanation plausible enough to be accepted, each shift in our dynamic subtle enough to be attributed to the stress of our circumstances. But the cumulative effect was the transformation of a strong partnership into a hollow performance that maintained the appearance of marriage while lacking its essential substance. By the time Emma's condition worsened and her final hospitalization began, David had already emotionally divorced himself from our family while maintaining the practical arrangements that allowed him to appear committed and supportive. He was physically present for important medical consultations, financially responsible for Emma's care, and superficially attentive to my emotional needs. But his heart and mind were focused on building a future that didn't include us. The man who had once been genuinely excited about becoming a father, who had supported me through fertility treatments and celebrated Emma's birth with authentic joy, had gradually become someone who saw our family as an obligation rather than a source of meaning and purpose. The erosion hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and devastating, leaving me married to a stranger who looked like my husband, but no longer shared his values, priorities, or commitment to our life together. The discovery that would shatter my remaining illusions about David's faithfulness came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 days after we'd buried Emma. I was sitting in her nursery, surrounded by the pale yellow walls and carefully chosen decorations that would never see their intended purpose, when I heard David's phone buzzing repeatedly from our bedroom where he'd left it while showering before a supposed client meeting. The phone had been ringing intermittently for several minutes, and normally I would have ignored it completely, respecting David's privacy and assuming any urgent calls would be redirected to voicemail. But something about the persistence of this particular caller, combined with the pattern of secretive phone conversations I'd been observing for months, made me walk to our bedroom and glance at the screen to see who was trying to reach him so desperately. The name displayed was Jessica Chen, and beneath it were 17 missed calls from the past 2 hours. My hands began trembling as I stared at the phone, recognizing the name from David's business contacts, but unable to understand why any professional colleague would be calling with such urgency, especially during the week following our daughter's funeral, when David had informed his office that he would be unavailable except for genuine emergencies. The phone buzzed again in my hands, and without thinking clearly about the implications of what I was doing, I answered the call. Jessica's voice was immediately recognizable from the few times I'd met her at David's office events. Young, professional, with a slight accent that suggested she'd grown up speaking another language before English. "David, thank God," she said, without waiting for me to speak. I've been trying to reach you all morning. The bleeding has stopped, but Dr. Rodriguez wants to see me again this afternoon to make sure everything is okay with the baby. I know this is terrible timing with everything you're dealing with, but I'm scared and I need you here." The words hit me like physical blows, each one rewriting my understanding of reality in ways that made the room spin around me. Jessica was pregnant. She was having complications that required medical attention. She expected David to be with her during this crisis, even though he'd just buried his daughter less than a week earlier. Most devastating of all, she clearly had no idea that she was speaking to his wife rather than to him. "I'm sorry," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "This is Sarah, David's wife." The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Then I heard Jessica's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like a sob being quickly stifled. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Oh my God, Sarah, I thought. David said you weren't supposed to. I'm so sorry about Emma. I can't imagine what you're going through right now." The casual way she said our daughter's name, as if Emma had been a topic of conversation between her and David, sent rage flowing through my veins like molten metal. This woman knew about our family tragedy. She knew about Emma's death. She'd been discussing our private grief with my husband while carrying his child and expecting his presence during her own medical emergency. "How far along are you?" I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my mind. 22 weeks, Jessica replied, and I could hear tears in her voice now. "Sarah, I know how this must look, and I want you to know that David and I never intended for things to happen this way. We tried to keep our distance after Emma got sick, but when we found out about the baby..." 22 weeks meant that Jessica had conceived David's child approximately 5 months earlier, during the period when Emma's condition was deteriorating and requiring the most intensive medical attention. While I was spending 18-hour days at the hospital, holding our dying daughter's hand and praying for miracles, David had been creating new life with another woman. "Where is David supposed to meet you?" I asked, my voice gaining strength, as my shock transformed into something much more dangerous. "The medical plaza on Camelback Road," Jessica said hesitantly. "Building C, Suite 304. But Sarah, maybe you should talk to David first. This isn't how either of us wanted you to find out." I ended the call without responding and stood in our bedroom holding David's phone while listening to the sound of water running in our ensuite bathroom. In less than 5 minutes, my husband would emerge from his shower, get dressed for what he'd told me was a client meeting, and drive across town to comfort his pregnant mistress during a medical scare. He would offer her the emotional support and physical presence that he'd been systematically withdrawing from me and Emma during our greatest time of need. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that for several moments I couldn't process the full implications of what I'd discovered. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or an emotional affair that had gotten out of control. This was a planned replacement of our family, executed while our daughter was dying, and I was too consumed with grief to notice the systematic theft of my husband's loyalty and affection. The sound of the shower turning off jolted me back to immediate reality. In 60 seconds, David would walk into our bedroom expecting to find his phone where he'd left it, and I would have to decide whether to confront him immediately or pretend ignorance while gathering more information about the scope of his betrayal. The discovery of his affair was devastating enough, but the timing, conducting this relationship while Emma was dying, planning a future with Jessica while attending our daughter's funeral, elevated his betrayal to a level of cruelty I hadn't imagined him capable of. I quickly replaced his phone on the nightstand exactly where he'd left it and walked back to Emma's nursery, my mind racing through the implications of everything I'd just learned. David had been living a double life for months, possibly longer. His decreased availability for Emma's care hadn't been due to work stress, but rather to time spent developing his relationship with Jessica. His emotional withdrawal from me hadn't been a response to grief, but preparation for leaving our marriage. Most devastating of all, David had been using Emma's terminal illness as cover for his affair, counting on my distraction and emotional devastation to hide his betrayal. He'd calculated that I would be too consumed with our daughter's medical crisis to investigate his suspicious behavior or question his increasingly frequent absences. In his mind, Emma's death would provide the perfect opportunity to file for divorce, claiming that our marriage couldn't survive the grief of losing a child. As I sat surrounded by Emma's unused belongings, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The pain of discovery was overwhelming, but underneath it was a clarity I hadn't experienced since before Emma's diagnosis. For months, I'd been attributing changes in David's behavior to stress and grief, making excuses for his emotional distance and decreased involvement in our family life. Now, I understood that every instance of his withdrawal, every suspicious phone call, every excuse for working late, had been connected to his systematic replacement of our family with Jessica and their unborn child. The calculation involved in David's betrayal was breathtaking in its thoroughness. He hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been orchestrating the end of our marriage while maintaining the appearance of being a devoted husband and father. He'd been planning his exit strategy while sitting beside Emma's hospital bed, calculating the optimal timing for abandoning us while appearing to be a grieving father who deserved sympathy and support. But David had made one critical miscalculation in his elaborate deception. He'd assumed that discovering his affair would break me completely, leaving me too devastated and emotionally shattered to fight back effectively. He'd counted on my grief over Emma's death to make me passive and compliant, accepting whatever settlement he offered in exchange for a quick and quiet divorce that wouldn't damage his professional reputation or social standing. What David didn't understand was that learning about his betrayal hadn't broken me. It had awakened something in me that I hadn't known existed. The woman who'd been consumed with caring for her dying daughter, who'd been making excuses for her husband's emotional absence, who'd been blaming herself for the deterioration of their marriage, was gone. In her place was someone who understood exactly what kind of war she was fighting, and who had no intention of losing. I heard David emerge from the bathroom and begin getting dressed, probably checking his phone for messages from Jessica and preparing to leave for their appointment. He would kiss me goodbye, express concern about how I was coping with Emma's loss, and promise to be home in time for dinner. Every gesture would be a performance designed to maintain his cover while he rushed to comfort the woman carrying his child. As I listened to David move around our bedroom, selecting clothes and gathering items for his day of deception, I began mentally cataloging everything I knew about his relationship with Jessica and planning my next moves. The discovery of his affair was devastating, but it was also the beginning of my transformation from victim to strategist. David thought he'd successfully hidden his betrayal until he could execute his exit plan on his own terms. Instead, he'd just given me the information I needed to ensure that his betrayal would cost him everything he'd tried to steal from me. The awakening moment hadn't just revealed David's affair, it had revealed my own capacity for strategic thinking under pressure. While David was planning to abandon his grieving wife after burying their child, I was already beginning to plan his complete and total destruction. Some betrayals are so profound that they can only be answered with absolute warfare, and David was about to learn that Sarah Sanderson Mitchell was not someone who could be discarded without consequences. The phone call from Jessica had ended. My marriage, as surely as Emma's death, had ended my motherhood, but it had also begun something else entirely. David's reckoning was about to begin, and he had no idea what kind of opponent his betrayal had created. The transformation from devastated wife to strategic operative began within minutes of ending the phone call with Jessica. While David finished getting dressed for his supposed client meeting, I was already planning the investigation that would expose every detail of his betrayal and provide the evidence I needed to ensure his complete destruction. The woman who had spent months making excuses for her husband's suspicious behavior was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival required documentation, verification, and absolute proof of every crime David had committed against our family. My first priority was establishing the timeline and scope of David's relationship with Jessica. The 22-week pregnancy meant their affair had begun during the most critical period of Emma's treatment. But I needed to know exactly when their relationship started and how it had developed alongside his systematic withdrawal from our family. The business world David inhabited was small and gossipy, which meant that other people had likely observed their relationship developing, even if they hadn't understood its significance. I started with social media investigation, something David wouldn't expect because he'd always dismissed my comfort with technology as unimportant compared to his financial expertise. Jessica Chen's Instagram account was publicly visible and provided a treasure trove of information about her lifestyle, social connections, and recent activities. Her posts from the past 6 months showed a progression from professional networking events to more personal gatherings, and David appeared in the background of several photos from corporate functions and casual social gatherings. What made my stomach turn was discovering that David had been bringing Jessica to professional events that I should have attended as his wife. Photos from the Phoenix Financial Planning Association annual gala in October showed David and Jessica standing together near the bar, their body language suggesting familiarity that went beyond professional collegiality. I remembered David telling me that spouses weren't invited to that particular event, which I'd accepted without question because I was consumed with managing Emma's medication schedule and upcoming surgery. The deeper I dug into Jessica's social media presence, the more evidence I found of David's systematic lies about his whereabouts during the past several months. A photo from a hiking trip to Camelback Mountain was dated the same weekend David had told me he was attending a financial planning conference in Tucson. Pictures from a wine tasting event in Scottsdale corresponded to an evening when David had claimed to be working late on quarterly reports for clients. Each discovery was like finding another piece of a puzzle that revealed the comprehensive nature of David's deception. He hadn't just been having occasional secret meetings with Jessica. He'd been living an entirely separate social life with her while lying to me about his activities and whereabouts. The affair wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a deliberate construction of an alternative relationship that he'd been building while our daughter was dying. My investigation expanded to include David's financial records, which I had access to through our joint accounts and shared business banking relationships. What I discovered was evidence of systematic financial deception that went far beyond hiding the costs of an affair. David had been making substantial cash withdrawals from our business accounts, deposits to credit cards I didn't know existed, and transfers to investment accounts that weren't included in our joint financial planning. The pattern of financial deception was particularly infuriating because David's expertise in financial planning had made it easy for him to hide his theft in ways that would be difficult for someone without his professional knowledge to detect. He'd been using complex transfer mechanisms and investment vehicles to move money from our joint accounts into resources that Jessica could access, essentially stealing from our family's financial security to fund his new relationship. Most damaging was the discovery that David had been systematically redirecting payments from my design business into accounts I couldn't access. Client payments that should have been deposited into Desert Bloom Design Studios' operating account had been rerouted through a series of business entities that David controlled, then transferred to investment accounts that were positioned to benefit Jessica rather than our joint financial planning goals. The theft wasn't just personal, it was criminal. David had been using his position as my business financial advisor to steal from my company while I was focused on Emma's medical care. He'd exploited my trust and my distraction during our family crisis to commit fraud that would have been obvious to me under normal circumstances, but was hidden by my consuming focus on our daughter's needs. As my investigation progressed, I realized that David's betrayal extended beyond his affair with Jessica to include systematic preparation for abandoning our marriage in ways that would leave me financially devastated and emotionally destroyed. He'd been calculating the optimal timing for filing divorce papers, probably planning to use Emma's death as evidence that our marriage couldn't survive the grief of losing a child. The email accounts associated with David's business provided additional evidence of his systematic deception and criminal financial activity. Using password information I'd acquired legitimately through our joint business planning, I was able to access correspondence that revealed the true scope of his relationship with Jessica and their plans for the future they were building together. The emails between David and Jessica painted a picture of a relationship that had begun as professional collaboration but had quickly evolved into emotional intimacy and physical involvement. More disturbing was their correspondence about me and Emma, where David portrayed himself as trapped in a marriage to an emotionally unstable woman whose obsession with their sick child was preventing him from pursuing his own happiness and professional goals. Reading David's descriptions of me and Emma to his mistress was perhaps the most painful aspect of my investigation. He'd characterized my dedication to Emma's medical care as obsessive and unhealthy, described my emotional responses to her condition as evidence of mental instability, and portrayed our marriage as something he was enduring rather than a partnership he was committed to preserving. The emails revealed that David and Jessica had been discussing their future together for months, making plans that assumed I would simply disappear from David's life once Emma's medical situation resolved itself. They'd researched neighborhoods where they wanted to live together, discussed career goals that assumed David would be free to relocate if necessary, and even begun planning how they would integrate their child into David's existing social and professional networks. Most chilling was their correspondence about the timing of David's exit from our marriage. They'd been calculating the optimal moment for David to file for divorce, considering factors like Emma's prognosis, my emotional stability, and the potential impact on David's professional reputation. The affair wasn't just about romantic attraction. It was a business partnership designed to maximize David's personal and financial benefits while minimizing the costs of leaving his current family. The investigation also revealed that Jessica was more than just David's mistress. She was his co-conspirator in financial fraud and his partner in planning my systematic destruction. Her background in marketing and business development had made her valuable in helping David restructure his financial affairs to minimize my access to joint assets and maximize their combined resources for building their new life together. Phone records accessible through our joint cellular plan provided additional evidence of the scope and timeline of David's betrayal. The frequency of calls and text messages between David and Jessica showed their relationship intensifying during the exact period when Emma's condition was becoming more critical and my need for David's support was greatest. The timing was particularly cruel because the phone records showed that David had been texting with Jessica during some of our most difficult moments as a family. While I was holding Emma during her recovery from surgery, David had been sending messages to his pregnant mistress. While we were meeting with doctors about Emma's declining prognosis, David had been making plans for romantic getaways with Jessica. The investigation revealed that David's relationship with Jessica had provided him with emotional refuge from the stress of Emma's condition, but instead of supporting his family during our crisis, he'd used that refuge as preparation for abandoning us entirely. Rather than drawing strength from his affair to be a better husband and father during our most difficult time, David had used his relationship with Jessica as evidence that he deserved happiness more than he deserved to fulfill his obligations to Emma and me. As weeks of investigation accumulated evidence of David's systematic betrayal and criminal activity, I began consulting with professionals who could help me understand the legal and financial implications of what I'd discovered. Robert Hayes proved invaluable in helping me understand that David's actions constituted not just grounds for divorce, but potential criminal charges for fraud and theft. The consultation with Robert was eye-opening because it revealed that my investigation had uncovered evidence of crimes that extended beyond personal betrayal to include violations of business law and financial regulations. David's theft from my business accounts, his systematic hiding of joint assets, and his fraudulent manipulation of investment accounts created liability that could result in criminal prosecution and civil penalties that would devastate his professional career and personal finances. More importantly, Robert explained that the evidence I'd gathered provided leverage for ensuring that David's betrayal would cost him far more than he'd ever anticipated. The financial fraud alone was sufficient to freeze his assets and potentially send him to prison, while the timing of his affair during Emma's terminal illness would ensure that any divorce settlement would be heavily weighted in my favor. The investigation phase had transformed me from a grieving mother and betrayed wife into someone who understood exactly what kind of war David had declared on our family and what weapons I would need to ensure his complete defeat. By the time I was ready to confront David about his affair, I possessed comprehensive evidence of his crimes and a strategic plan for ensuring that his betrayal would destroy him more completely than he'd ever imagined possible. David thought he'd been clever in hiding his affair and planning his exit from our marriage, but his arrogance had led him to leave evidence trails that exposed every aspect of his deception. The man who'd assumed his grieving wife was too broken to fight back effectively was about to discover that he'd created an opponent who understood exactly how to use his own crimes against him. The investigation had revealed that David's betrayal wasn't just personal. It was criminal, systematic, and thoroughly documented through his own communications and financial transactions. The evidence I'd gathered would ensure that his affair with Jessica cost him his marriage, his business, his professional reputation, and potentially his freedom. Some betrayals demand complete destruction of the betrayer, and David was about to learn that lesson in the most public and devastating way possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.